So the last section of our discussions before the lunch break, which should be around 12:30, concerns integration of descriptive requirements for archival digital materials. And there are fewer questions on this topic in the survey, but I'll go through them anyways. So first we have a question which asks or says that RADS includes a chapter on records in electronic form. Does this chapter still provide an adequate basis for description of digital archival material? And overwhelmingly, people said no, 62%, although 11% said yes. But in the groups, it's even 93% of those who answered the survey who said that this chapter is not adequate anymore. The question after that, actually is the only other question in that section, mentions that PREMIS is a metadata standard developed to record information relating to the preservation of digital objects. How should an archival description standard relate to PREMIS? And in the answers, well, a large chunk of the answers were not mapped, and maybe we can go back on what people said specifically about that, but 27% of the individuals said to keep it separate, but that the standard should reference or make links to premise. 64% of the people answering as groups had this answer, and 10% said to incorporate some premise elements into the standard. So, regarding the description of digital material.
So I guess my comments on this were I'd be curious to know what everybody was thinking in terms of why RAD isn't working. I know I've had very different experiences with digital records, and I know why it's not working for me, but it might be different for other people. And my question is, and it might not be in the majority, but it's in how I've done my digital work, is I've always gone back to the analog. So whatever I did for the analog, I tried to do for the digital, because it was the only way I could do arrangement and description. It was the only way I could fit it into the systems that I was using. So for me, I'm not sure that there should be a chapter on electronic records, because most of the things that I've dealt with are hybrid. And really, I think where archives is going, maybe not today, but 5-10 years down the road, is that everybody's going to be dealing with digital or analog. You're not going to have a choice. So my question is, do we really need a chapter on electronic records, and should electronic records be part of everything? Because they're part of moving images, they're part of sound, they're part of everything we do. And I don't know, because I don't know what others think about that.
It's really a carrier versus content issue, and I think that's really in the older days of describing electronic records, we were mostly concerned with how many CD-ROMs we had and how many tapes we had. But what's clear in the literature on arranging and describing digital records is that all of our traditional tools, whether it's appraisal models or descriptive tools, should apply equally to records in electronic form as they should to analog records. So, I mean, I liken this to the debate that I have in my own institution around copy negs. And if copy negs were created, how do we physically manage the copy negs we create of our original archival material? And then, in the old days, we used to do this funky thing where we would get photos from the community, and then we would create copy negs and give the originals back to the donor. And so what we actually have are surrogates of archival records, but not real archival records, but they're described as if they're archival records. And so these are some legacy issues that inform the development of our descriptive standards, because we can't say to our community, as you were saying earlier, we can't just say, okay, well, just pretend you don't have these problems. And that's not going to work for our loan arrangers and our small institutions. They need a mechanism to transition from one way of thinking to another way of thinking that's more compatible with the international standard.
Just one comment on that. Copying eggs is a great example, but also digitization as well. Because when you digitize an analog object or even the original digital object, you have the same issues there too. So it's definitely an issue we're going to be dealing with until the end of time.
So I struggle with the premise question. And I don't have a good answer to this, but I think the issue is, what does a user actually need to know about what somebody did to digital objects? Like, you're not going to need I would never want to link out the full premise record. But maybe it's useful to know that this was in a Mac environment, or, this is being migrated and the format isn't exactly what it was originally. Those sorts of questions. But it comes back to the same sort of linking out to other media standards. And being robust enough that for simple use cases that you can deal with it, and if you need to get in a lot more detail, then there's another standard to go to. But it isn't a description standard on its own. It's more, it's definitely preservation, but there's elements there. Just as for analog, we have things like technical details where you're indicating, like whatever the example is. But there's analog sort of analogies for the same sort of preservation information in the descriptive record.
I actually, I don't really have a huge problem with the chapter, although I think that Lisa's kind of onto something about this idea. Like, we probably don't need a chapter on electronic records. What we probably need to do is ensure that analog and electronic records are dealt with sort of throughout everything that we're doing, because that's a more accurate reality. I mean, you have digital moving images, you have digital maps, you have digital everything. Where I found that I have struggled with it is kind of what Paul alluded to, this carrier versus content. I think that if you were going to really look at something that we could possibly improve, it would be teasing those things apart and determining what is necessary for the user, because the archival descriptions are primarily for the user, and we have other internal standards to maintain, like premise, for example, to do what we need it to do. So those things about the operating systems, those things about the carriers, what happened to the carrier after you ingested the content into your sort of digital preservation system is something that I've personally struggled with. We don't keep floppy disks and CD-ROMs after we, what is going on with that kind of stuff? And is it important to document that it came from that? How do you do the physical description of the content, which is presumably what we should be emphasizing? I think that issue is really where it's where we struggle, and I imagine it's where the small shop, that's the challenge. Otherwise, it's mostly the same content: titles, dates, scope and content, and so forth. I don't see a huge problem with it other than this physical description issue.
Just to come back, and I'd said earlier with respect to our hierarchical systems, our users don't care about our hierarchical systems, and they certainly don't care about our preservation challenges. They just like the stuff, and they'd preferably like it online, and they'd preferably like it now.
I think it could be really useful for us to look at premise and say, well, what parts of premise are actual descriptive metadata that would be useful in an archival description? Because premise provides a lot of guidance on things like systems and other issues, and we could possibly identify things that are, mandatory and other things that are optional for the user. But so that's kind of how I always thought about premise. Well, we could pull things out of it. I know that, working at a university, the researchers who are working with digital content don't really care about our archival descriptions at all. They want the content, and they want to load it into high-powered, computational systems to do their own work. And so I think we should really be aware of what people are doing with electronic records. It's not quite the same as it is with analog material that you have to come in and sort of meticulously go through. My experience is that they want aggregate, and they want all of it, and they want to be able to take the content and load it into their own systems. And if the databases that we're using are all sort of fully text searchable when you have digital content in there anyway, it really takes a lot of emphasis or a lot of onus off us to describe digital records at the item or file level. I mean, we don't, you just don't need to, if the file is there in the system, then it's going to be indexed. And that's really where the use for the end user is going to come from, making sure that the indexing is what it needs to, where it needs to be.
I think there's a bunch of different issues that are floating around here. One is the issue around the idea that the information is coming in multiple formats. Richard, I think in your article on RAD, you deal with this very nicely, and you point us towards the solution that RDA made between, getting at this idea of different formats. There's an interesting article as well by Jinfeng Niu that looks at, the whole range of different reasons that we make copies of material, and pointing out that there's challenges in managing all of these different copies, and we need standards regimens that allow us to manage all of these and to understand the relationship of each to the other. In terms of researchers wanting access to digital preservation metadata, give us a few more years and let's see if they want access to that metadata, because once we start doing more format migrations where we're losing functionality, where we're losing different aspects of the original systems that enabled the creation of this data, users may find that they would like to see exactly what was the state that this was received and what did the archive do to it over the 20, 30 years or something like that. So I think we should be very careful. Yes, it's useful to think about some of the analog copying and different formats and so on, but the digital, we're getting into a lot of different issues that we also need to be at least making sure that we're creating a standards regimen that is going to enable this data to be captured and represented, and then we can figure out down the road how much users need to get access to it, for example. And I would also point out that earlier, Jennifer talked about some of the aspects that aren't covered well in other standards that, maybe this revision of our national standard could address. And she talked about things like the actual management of the record by the archives, better, more nuanced view of the record history, and so on. And I think with the digital, we're also facing another example of this, in that digital information tends to be multiply connected in different ways, and we don't really have good ways of representing non-provenance connections among information. And this is something that our users are very interested in, and it's something that's inherent within the digital medium. So I think we also need to think more about what is it that we want to be able to represent with digital information. And also keeping in mind that it's not that all these new relationships suddenly came about with the digital era. They're always there, but it's a lot more difficult to conceptualize them and manage them in non-digital areas. So there are new possibilities for what we can do in terms of managing relationships between creators, users, how we think about creation. Tom Nesmith's work on societal provenance, or Chris Hurley on parallel provenance, for example. There's lots of rich work out there that we can use to inform some of the ways that we think about this.
That raises some of the questions upon whether that becomes a user problem rather than an archival institution problem. In my institution, of the 7 million records in our EDMS, 15% of the records are used by departments for repurposing purposes, where they'll take previous digital content and they'll reuse components of it in new records that they're creating along the same lines, whether it's zoning or planning records in particular. So the question is whether it's the archival institution's responsibility to show those related records, or whether it's the user's responsibility to identify those when they're accessing our database systems to find relationships between records, and whether we need to represent that in a descriptive system, or just is the user's problem to make those connections.
I just wanted to say that this seems like a perfect case where spending some time developing like an entity model, it would be very useful. when we're talking about arrangement and description, we're talking about intellectual arrangement. And I think that there can be a parallel here. And talking about when we're dealing with content and carrier, we're really talking about intellectual description when we're talking about a content standard. And once we're getting down to actually creating these like highly specific and different descriptions for each like instance of the carrier or the instantiation that we're looking at, then we're maybe losing sight of what the role in terms of access that archival description plays. I think that there's a way that we can tie that together with like an intellectual entity that is being described that helps encompass that, and that then makes it clear to end users what aspects, it's almost like sub-elements we're talking about, where we're describing like a content, where we're describing like, oh, this is like a preservation master that was made, and then this is one access copy, and then this is like a different derivative that was made for this purpose, and we've kept them, but they're related to this intellectual entity. That's something that I think that Ferber and then, through that RDA does well, and I think that that could be very useful here in terms of like dealing with like electronic records. I also just want to say, I think that in the contemporary environment, I think it's naive to think that we can have one chapter that just solves the question of electronic records and goes on. And I'd much rather see examples in an implementation guide or sub-elements where necessary within different sections that apply across formats.
Also, if we go to a standard that is organized by area of description rather than media type, then we need to think about what belongs in which area, right? So I think there's been a tendency to take everything that has to do with electronic records and think of it in terms of its physical description, where some of the stuff is actually part of description control, or what the archivist is doing, or custodial history. So mapping out some of the stuff that is in Chapter 9 to how it relates to areas of description more specifically would help, I think, that way too, right, in terms of thinking about what's an intellectual description and what's a physical description.
And I agree, I think, with that. That seems to me RAD kind of made it easy, though, to just treat physical description as the same as the item, and so it didn't distinguish between that content and carrier. And if we can get that back, that would be one of the areas I think we could improve on, including ISAG. Like, it's not there either, right? So, and yeah, the conceptual model approach would probably really help clarify that.
And also today, we've got carriers that are cloud carriers. Now, even though it's just somebody's server in a back room somewhere, it's still not always a physical thing that we can touch. So the carriers have changed since RAD was first, or the carriers that we're dealing with as digital archivists have changed too. So we don't always see those carriers. We don't always have control of those carriers. Unlike paper copy, which is slightly different, although I'm sure people can think of examples that are similar to the cloud that way. So I would just add that in there. And as well, just one thought I've had about this, because I've been thinking about this a lot, is that with digital files, I find like when I get a 1 TB drive with 100,000 or 1 million files on it, we have to do MPLP usually to even just get it out, and most archivists have to do that. So I don't know if that affects anything in terms of RAD. I've been thinking about this, and I still don't have any idea whether it has anything to do with it at all. But I find with digital, I have 1 million records that I have no clue what they are, versus paper, where I could see the paper and at least go, oh, okay, I can kind of see it, so I can get an idea of what's in there. I don't know if it has anything to do with it, but I thought I'd throw it out there.
Maybe just pick up on that question. It does strike me, and I think, Creighton, you were kind of alluding to this too, that the ways people are going to approach it is slightly different. Like, I think, especially I'm thinking sort of something like email, where we've always imagined people are going to go through correspondence page by page, but they're not doing that with email, right? I think they are wanting to come in with various sort of analytics tools and so on. So how that impacts description, I think, will be kind of interesting to see. Yeah,
and also like with websites, I know I've dealt with a lot of email and websites, and even just to arrange and describe and appraise has been interesting. This is before today when we've got better tools. So I wonder about that too, how it's going to impact things. And I think when we do this, that we have to look at formats we haven't even thought about yet and things, because social media takes on a whole new level, websites take on a whole new level, email, databases. We've got so much more today than we had when RAD was originally done. So it's just interesting.
I think that thinking about other formats coming into is another good argument for taking more of an area of description approach too, because then you are not constantly just adding I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say, but it's a more principled approach, right? And then you have to think about things in terms of what the purpose of the description is as well, right?
And I was just going to say that this also brings us back to Martine's point about hybrid collections. That fundamentally all collections are hybrid collections, and the comment was made in one of the group responses that the danger of that this sort of chapter-based approach balkanizes the way that you think about the record. And I think that's also what you're saying, Jennifer, about wanting to make sure that we remember to keep our eye on the whole and how all the different component parts fit together.
And also just one more comment from what we were discussing earlier about the standard and an implementation guide. That would work really well here because we have no clue what's going to be big in 5 years. Facebook probably won't exist. Twitter may exist. I don't even want to know what I got to deal with in 5 years. That would help us because then we could really react to the materials that all of us are dealing with on the ground in an implementation guide, I think, with examples anyway.
The only thing to add to that, I'm just recalling some of our conversations with the accession working group about sort of delineating process from the descriptive elements. And so the process of accessioning, how you do accessioning is different than an accession record. And the same is true with archival description. And particularly with electronic records, where I know there are a lot of institutions that don't really have a process yet, or they have pieces of a process, or every new acquisition requires a new process. And I think that we need to be very careful to avoid being prescriptive about how to handle these new unknown media types and this idea, I think Lisa, you mentioned it earlier, the sort of philosophical position of treating electronic records kind of fundamentally the same way, same as analog records, in terms of archival description, is another justification for an ISAG kind of model in terms of the arrangement of the standard, because truly, the chapter doesn't do it, and I would be concerned about in an implementation guide being providing too much guidance on how to get your electronic records to the point when they can be described. We still haven't really done that. We have all kinds of things on a server, but we're not describing them. And we're not describing them because we haven't found a way to provide access to them in the same way that we can with our electronic records. So I think if there are areas that we could improve on, this issue of the carrier and content is one of them, but also how do you describe electronic records that are already accessible versus electronic records that are not accessible? And it's not quite the same thing as use and access restrictions as it is about the barriers to the technical barriers or the rights issues and so forth. It's complicated, and I think that there's a lot of places that haven't really broached any of this because it's overwhelming, and I don't think that we can sort of solve all of the problems of electronic records by revising RAD. I mean, there's still quite a bit of work to be done on appraisal and arrangement, and we can't really tell someone how to arrange their hybrid collection so that it can be prepared for archival description. and yet that needs to be dealt with before you can describe your records. Yeah. Describe your server environment. Do you tell people that you have terabytes of data that you haven't dealt with? You've just acquired it and tried to do some modicum of preservation work. It's a disservice to the community to not have it described, but it's the greater disservice is not being able to make it accessible yet.
To sort of bring it back to structure of RAD, is it feasible the same way with the ICA standards kind of separated description of the records from description of creator, but make sure they're linked? Could it be a possibility to have, again, like description of carriers as separate but linked? So especially if we had the intellectual description, and that might get into some of the abilities to manage all those multiple versions that we're creating over time for access and preservation reasons, and have core categories for what's described there in terms of managing those objects as carriers?
I don't know. I think the focus of the descriptive standard needs to be on the content. And then you have to decide what the user needs to know. But in terms of describing the carriers separately, that seems a little complicated. I mean, it may be, this was the original, and then there's certain things you do in between, but which you may not make accessible right away as default as part of the standard. It's something that would be available through a preservation metadata, or it's an element. But maybe I'm not quite following what you mean in terms of a parallel thing, but I think it could be handled more through the elements you define.
I'm not quite sure what I'm proposing either, but I think it was more sort of thinking along the lines of a place where physical description, all that material that's currently in RAD, some of which is very useful in the analog, but is that a home for it? Is a section that describes carriers? And then linking that to the descriptive elements that describe the content?
It's almost a custodial problem, especially where you have a donor who has, over the course of their career, themselves migrated from 8-inch floppies to 3.5-inch floppies to hard drives to cloud storage, and documenting that through the custodial and scope and content really becomes the real question, especially when we're ingesting that into modern digital repositories where the previous carrier was really irrelevant.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, I actually kind of like your suggestion, partly because I think it's something that's done in other contexts, particularly with vendors that provide digitization services to archives. My experience is that all of their carriers, like they send something to us on a hard drive and it's coded with a number, and they keep a record of that drive and what content has been put on that drive and where it was sent and so forth. And the value in that is that on that particular carrier, you have some information on what was put on there and what was deleted from that carrier and what was overwritten, and sort of, if you ever needed to do forensic recovery, like that information would be really critical. We may be obsessing about the details here, but I think there's a lot to be lost when we discard carriers, and there's a lot, how do we, if we're not describing the carrier, what are we doing with the labels on the carriers? Like, are we photographing the carriers, which is a practice that has been recommended by a lot of digital curators? Like, I don't think we can just cast away the issue. I really think it's sort of a key place where we can provide some kind of guidance. I don't know what that would look like yet, but I'm just thinking of sort of forensic work and other situations where information about what was on a carrier at different points in time, a log, like this is getting into systems kind of environment work, but that is information that is critical to proving the reliability of a record-keeping system. So I don't know how we describe it, but I think that we need to recognize that it's important.
I would also add that it's not just carriers, it's formats that we're talking about. So, it's one thing like to track the carrier and the metadata or labels or whatever associated with it. That's great. But we also need to be thinking about formats. And I don't agree that it's simply a custodial problem, because if you are practicing a digital preservation strategy that includes format migration, every time you do a format migration, you're losing functionalities. And so if you have a user who wants to get back to the original functionalities, they're going to want to know that the object exists in whatever the format was that it was acquired. So it's not enough just to think that we're creating an access copy and we only need to describe the access copy because that's what the person's going to use when they're accessing it. I would also note that we're talking about formats as though or carriers or digital objects as though they're self-contained wholes. And increasingly, this is not the case. And Lisa's example of social media is a great example. What is a tweet? Is it the 140 characters, or is it the 200 points of metadata that support those 140 characters? What is it that we've actually captured? If we are archiving tweets, are we actually getting the whole thing, or are we doing like a screenshot of a TweetDeck or something like that? Like there's lots of issues around item level management that we haven't really talked that much about. The media chapters assume a kind of item level management, and as we move into new formats and various digital formats, what that item level description looks like is going to be very, very different depending on what it is that whether you're looking at, Facebook feeds or Twitter or email even, the sort of metadata shadow that goes with an email, for example. So these kinds of issues, we want to make sure that whatever we do with the standard, it's open to enable this material to be managed in a way that not only allows it to be described, but allows it to be integrated into the whole realm of records.
And I think this kind of goes back to what Richard was saying about isolating the information from the carrier. For example, in a tweet, if you're looking at the content, you want to know about the content of the tweet, not the nature of the Twitter platform. But it's also important to remember that, I think it's the Electronic Evidence Act, and Chapara has certainly made the case that the authenticity of the electronic document isn't found in the document, but the system that created and preserved and maintained it and distributed it. So there's the content side of it, but then there's the system side of it. And that's kind of what we were talking about in our accession standard as well, as taking in these electronic records. We really can't be snowed under by terabytes of documents. Rather, we want to understand how the records came to us, what system were they created under, maintained under, and distributed with. And I think that's a reliable way to describe the records rather than trying to address every individual one. And then, like I was saying, isolating the content from the carrier.
I mean, one possible solution to that could be, again, if you keep coming back to this idea of a implementation guide and a sort of set of core elements, but you could very well have a set of core elements for electronic records that's a separate set of elements, because it's kind of different. You can't say that the description of the operating system is a core element for analog material, but I think that it is a core element for the description of electronic records. And my sense is that you could probably have, identify, and this could be one of our sort of contributions in this area, is like what do we think are the core elements for describing electronic records? Because I don't know that we have a good sense of that yet. And I think that the implementation guide can address both sets of core elements simultaneously, because you're going from the general to the specific. So when you're dealing with an aggregate of records, you either have an analog or a digital or a hybrid collection, which would require referring to both sets of core elements, perhaps, but or merging them together in some way. But and it proceeds down. I'm just getting the sense that we don't really know what we need to be describing and what we don't necessarily need to be describing.
Maybe one last intervention, and then we'll stop for lunch.
So I definitely agree with that, and this is sort of fleshes out more what I was saying earlier in terms of what's the balance between what we're collecting, what we know about the object and what users need to know. I mean, in terms of item level management, I hope we'll never be manually creating item level descriptions of electronic records. So it's a matter of how do you pull in what you're creating already if you're doing automated processes on electronic records through something like Archive or other digital preservation systems, as opposed to what are you putting in the record. So I really like this idea of what do you need to know, what's the minimal set.
Sorry, can I just pose one more question? I know that the folks with AAQ have worked on a document that that is directed towards people that are interested in doing their own records management components for private individuals. Has this issue been addressed at all within that document itself about the digital question? What kind of documentation should be kept?
I think the document you refer to is not from AAQ, but from Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec. I think it was like a kind of a guide for, Monsieur, Madame, tout le monde, everybody, how to keep their personal papers. I haven't looked into that for a long time. There might be a little part or not even chapter, but a page maybe on electronic records, but I don't think they go into much detail. It's very, very like, okay. Oh la la. I don't think I'll do any kind of resume of what was discussed, because I think the last few interventions pretty much summed up what we discussed before that. I think the key word for this session here, the hashtag, if you will, is caution, not to get involved too deep and try to assess and keep a distance to try to have a way of doing things or understand what we want to do with the description of electronic records before we commit ourselves. So, I think that's it. But this is, I think, compared to the other discussions, I think it's something that's a bit more, not frightening, but something that involves a lot of thinking and discussion that needs to be done. Not that the others don't, but I think in this case, I think it's a really, really central and important element. Okay, so lunch break is from, now till 1:30, and then we have 3 other sessions left for this afternoon. I don't know if there's something else to add before we leave. Bon appétit.